Yes, I got Salty Soul playing.
She's okay.
Listen, shout out to all my Kenyans out there, man. Mambo, Poa, Jambo. Come on. Alright. Alright, today we are going to continue the Big Four series and we're looking at Kenya. So I've actually got quite a soft spot for Kenya because one of my first experiences as an adult with the African continent was when I went to intern with a private equity company in one of their portfolio companies at the time, which was oil and gas, and that was in Nairobi. So I spent a few months in Nairobi, which was really, really nice. So yeah, I always have fond memories of my time in Nairobi and my time with Kenya. So I'm looking forward to this one. This one's going to be really good. So in a similar format to last week's one, we're going to be provide just a quick kind of like run through of like, you know, population, all of that stuff. Then we're going to get into kind of like just the economic landscape. So kind of like strengths, and then consider some issues, and then deep dive into the capital markets. So we'll have a look at the public market and then the private markets and what's been happening from a funding perspective. And then I'll just give some thoughts on kind of like the future and, you know, potentially just some thoughts and speculation about how things might play out. So as of 2023, I believe, 2023, Kenya has a population of 55.1 million people. In 2022, the population grew by 1.9% the previous year. Kenya has the third largest economy in Africa, behind Nigeria, which is first, and South Africa, which is second. So in terms of, if we take a deeper dive in terms of this population growth, it's quite interesting to see that at the beginning of the first quarter of the 20th century, Kenya had a population which was fewer than 4 million. So I've got some notes, so forgive me, I'll be reading. Then by the late 1940s, this population had risen then to 5 million, and at independence in 1963, it was more than 8 million and growing rapidly. The population then exceeded 20 million by the mid-1980s, and after that, the growth rate began slowing quite dramatically. But nonetheless, if we extrapolate for the 21st century, the rate of natural increase was still above the world average, as I think at this current time, 2/3 of Kenyans were under the age of 30. So the country's higher than average growth rate is expected to continue for some time, kind of like still keeping in line with the trend of Africa having a very youthful population in comparison to the global average. So here it says that the pressure of such a population explosion produced limited employment opportunities, has had rising costs in terms of for health services, for educational services, and some infrastructure, and an inability to generate the resources to build housing in both urban and rural areas. The most important causes of this country, of Kenya's explosive growth, was a sharp fall in mortality rates, which is a similar theme that was the case for Nigeria and Egypt and South Africa that we're going to look at later. So here on screen, you've got I'll quickly just throw it up. Here's a quick breakdown in terms of Kenya's age. This is 2019. So if you look, under 15 and 15 to 29 makes up considerably more than half, and then if you throw in 30 to 44, it's quite interesting. But if we look, let's say about from 25 to about 74, which is kind of like the working population age, as we can see that the Kenya's youthful population will continue to grow and hopefully continue to kind of like, as long as they are provided with the resources to be productive, this could be a good thing for Kenya, especially as kind of like some of the people from 29 to about 59 start to transition into a place where they will no longer be economically active participants in the economy. Kenya's GDP was estimated in 2022 to be in the area of $264 billion. And then when we add in the size of the informal economy and make adjustments on that end, we actually see that it was predicted by the World Economics to be estimated to be $388 billion, which is 47% larger than the official estimates. So we can see here how the informal economy and other adjustments play a huge part in kind of unlocking and untapping a lot of Kenya's economic potential. So when we look at Kenya's natural resources and minerals, we see that they are very well endowed with very rare and valuable resources. So when we look at Kenya's natural resources and minerals, which are found in Kenya, they include zinc, soda ash, salt, limestone, gemstones, hydropower, and petroleum. And obviously different resources have great commercial significance, like these rare earth elements. So very, very popular and can provide a very, very lucrative stream of income for the government. The backbone of the Kenyan economy is horticulture and the agriculture sector. The agriculture sector in particular, which contributes around 33% of Kenya's gross domestic product, and the agriculture sector employs more than 40% of the total population and 70% of the rural population. So we can see that this East African country plays into a wider theme that is always discussed kind of like with the African Union, and that is the power of agriculture not only to recover, also to feed the world from a global economic standpoint. Kenya's gross domestic product was $264 billion at the end of 2022. So while Kenya is very well endowed with physical resources, the concern here again is one from a human capital perspective. So 2/3 of Kenyans live in poverty, making less than $3.20 per day. And this has been relatively quite consistent since Kenya's independence in 1963. And as a result, the vast majority of Kenyans, particularly women and girls, are considered chronically vulnerable. There's also a large gap between the rich and the poor. Approximately 70% of Kenyan families chronically vulnerable due to poor nutrition, food insecurity, and preventable diseases. Many Kenyans suffer from economic inequality, while a minority elite continues to exploit their labor, resources, and opportunities. This seems to be a common theme, unfortunately, across the African continent. There are being headwinds made in order to potentially lessen that gap. Now, when we look at the capital markets, let's start with the public market. So just look on the screen now, you should see a graph once again depicting the leading companies in Kenya in 2022 by market capitalization. So it's quite interesting because while the Nigeria one was relatively close to a certain extent with the first three, I believe it was Dangote Cement, Airtel, and MTN Nigeria. But this one, it seems to be Safaricom with $11.9 billion, which is, the telecommunications company. And then second, it just shortens down to Equity Group Holdings, which had a market capitalization value of $1.7 billion, followed by the KCB Group with $1.2 billion. And both of those companies, both Equity Group Holdings and KCB, own the main commercial banks in Kenya. So it seems like there's a thesis in terms of fintech here also in Kenya, as well as this was the case in Nigeria as well. And then in the private capital markets, we've seen Kenya really punch above its weight in the space, right? So Kenya received 22% of the funding that came to the African continent in terms of venture capital investment, whilst it only contributes 4% to the continent's GDP and population. That's pretty impressive. And when we look at some of the major deals that took place and the major funding rounds that took place, we can see that there's the ingenuity that's taking place on the ground in Kenya is really developing and creating a name for itself. And it's attracting investors to really consider what's going on in Kenya. So when we look at M-Copper, which raised a $75 million round, M-Copper is an asset financing service. They provide a platform for people and businesses to connect, which is really impressive. And then you've got Wasoko, who raised a $125 million Series B. And Wasoko allows retailers in East Africa to order products from suppliers via SMS or its mobile app for same-day delivery to their stores and shops via a network of logistic drivers. The company also provides a buy now, pay later option for retailers who need working capital in order to order more goods. I was really impressed by it and want to pay more attention to going forward is Sun King, who raised a $260 million Series D, and ultimately they're participating in the solar space. And if you remember on the Nigeria video, I mentioned and said that is an underutilized space and resource, and I think a lot more entrepreneurs, businesses, and even governments should pay attention to how they can leverage that, especially as we transition to a green world. And Sun King sells, installs, and finances solar homes for the 1.8 billion off-grid and under-electrified consumers in the world. And they are headquartered in Nairobi. So you can see that's really impressive what's going on in the space. And I expect a lot more investment to flow, especially into the region, particularly as we see kind of the rise of Rwanda, Tanzania participating, what some economists and investors have dubbed now Silicon Savannah has taken place. As with most nations, the political class and political leadership of Kenya will play a very large part in making sure that the gains that we're seeing Kenya being provided with not only continue, but also continue to increase. So I think there's been some interesting deals being made by Kenya in order to secure its future as a potential global leader in terms of different things such as finances. And we've seen that with, the introduction of the Economic Partnership Agreement between the United Kingdom and Kenya. It came out on the 8th of December 2020. I'm just going to read something that registers it. It says, as one of the largest economies in East Africa, Kenya is an important trading partner for the UK. The UK market accounts for 43% of total exports of vegetables from Kenya, as well as at least 9% of cut flowers. And this agreement will support Kenyans working in these sectors by maintaining tariff-free market access to the UK. Top goods imports to the UK from Kenya last year were in tea, coffee and spices, vegetables and cut flowers. So obviously the UK, by virtue of its decision to leave the European Union, is currently negotiating deals of this kind. And Kenya seems to have signed a relatively, from what I can see, it seems a relatively mutually beneficial deal. But I think what will be more interesting for Kenya will be its relationship with the countries in East Africa and the countries in Africa wider, with the African Union and obviously with the East African community. I think that would be interesting to see. So yeah, Kenya has a lot going for it. I think it's a very viable space. I love the people. I actually need to go back. I actually need to spend some time there again, see some of my friends. I will see that the venture capital space will continue to grow. I actually was supposed to invest in a fund. I was introduced by one of my friends on the ground. Didn't end up getting invested, but just even learning about kind of like how the Kenyan Stock Exchange is making sure that they are creating a pipeline journey for potential startups that are looking at IPOing, providing them over that kind of like 7 to 8 year journey in terms of maturity is really interesting and impressive to see that, just consultations like that are taking place, being had. So yeah, the future is very viable for Kenya, and now I can understand why it really punches above its own weight in the private markets. So yeah, that's pretty much it on Kenya. I hope the video was interesting. Please, once again, if it was interesting, if it was helpful for you, like, comment, subscribe, and hope to see you next week where we look at Egypt. And on that note, Kwaheri.